Hello and welcome to English II. I'm your online teacher, Miss Abear. We have been looking at Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail, and we've been looking at how an author uses rhetoric to advance his purpose and how he uses rhetoric to develop his ideas and advance that purpose. And so we've been looking at all of those different tools that we can use in order to track those so that we can have an effective way to communicate these, whether that's through an essay or through some other means. As you know, this is part of the Engaged New York curriculum, and all of the resources for today's lesson will be linked in the YouTube comments, in the YouTube description, so that you can get all of the information that you need. We always look at the end of the unit task, and so I want to remind you of that before every lesson, so that as we are working through the lesson, you can know what our purpose is moving forward. So at the end of this unit, you are going to rely on your reading and your analysis of Letter from Birmingham Jail to write a well-developed response to the prompt. Analyze how King develops and refines his claims to advance his purpose. So as we've been reading, we've been looking at what his purpose is. We've been looking at how he uses rhetoric to advance that purpose, how he uses word choices, specific word choices, to advance that purpose. We've also tracked his central ideas and his central claims and how he develops those. And so that should help you when it comes time to write this end of unit assessment. All right, today's agenda, we are introducing our lesson agenda now. We will look at being accountable for our homework. We will do a masterful reading of paragraphs 16 through 18. We will have a reading and discussion time. And of course, we're going to do a quick write. And then we will close with a little bit of homework. You can see the standards are on the board in front of you, as well as the text that we are going to be working with, and that is Letter from Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., paragraphs 16 through 18. So let's look at some accountability for your homework. So I want you to work with a small group. Take out your rhetorical impact tracking tool, and I want you to discuss the rhetorical devices that King uses in paragraphs 12 through 15. Great job. Let's look at a couple of those rhetorical devices that I heard you guys talking about. We had some rhetorical questions. How can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? We heard some repetition. Let us turn to a more concrete example. Let me give another example. And we also saw some parallel structure. So I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court because it is morally right. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong. You see that parallel structure, you see that repetition, and you see those rhetorical questions. There was much more rhetoric in that section that I didn't bring up here, and that's okay, but it's things that you should have on your rhetorical analysis tracking tool. So let's move on to our masterful reading, and I will tell you that paragraphs 16 through 18. Paragraph 16 is in red on your text, and that's because when Dr. King is reciting his letter, he leaves out that section. Let's talk about that for a second, about why. If you refer back to my lesson 1, you know that I said there were different versions floating around out there. And you also heard me give accolades to my producer for pointing out to me that Dr. King's letter was written on multiple different types of paper, or whatever he had available to him. Some of that was toilet paper. Some of that was paper, some of that was margins of newspapers, and also some magazines. All kinds of different things that he could write on is what he did write on. And so that kind of helps explain why there are multiple versions kind of floating around out there, because if Dr. King put all this together and then at the end wrote his thoughts out, and then sometime later somebody found, oh, I found this newspaper where he had also written these words. Well, we don't know exactly exactly where he had in his thought process put those paragraphs or put that text, but we have an idea, and that's why there are multiple versions out there. It's also why when he recites it, he recites that letter from a different place. He's no longer confined to that jail cell. He has come out and he is reciting it then. And so you will see that sometimes he himself gets tongue-tied and goes back and forth. And you'll see that throughout this masterful reading as we're going through. All that to say, paragraph 16 in your text is not recited by Dr. King. So either you will read that individually, your teacher in your classroom may read that out loud, or may have someone in your classroom read paragraph 16. Once you finish reading that paragraph, then you will go to 2233 on the YouTube video, and you will watch it until 24:18, where the end of paragraph 18. Great job. I know, isn't that very powerful? Yeah, I agree. Very powerful to hear him say that and speak those words. Let's read and discuss paragraphs 16 and 17. I want you to get into a small group. I don't want just a partner. I want you to have several people that you can bounce these ideas off of. And so I want you to reread or scan back over paragraphs 16 through 18. And I want you to discuss the following questions. Make sure you're writing down your responses and make sure you're writing them in complete sentences. Great job. Let's talk about some of these answers now. Remember that we're not going to answer all of the questions together as a class. I'm only looking at the ones that will help you at the end write that end of the unit task. But that's being said, some of these other questions that are being asked that we're not discussing as a whole group are still important to lead you to some of the other questions and responses that you do need. So without further ado, let's look at King's purpose for paragraph 16. King's purpose is to provide an example of how a law can seem just but yet be unjust in its application. Okay? And then how does King's references to his arrest further his purpose? It provides a specific example of how a law can seem just yet be unjust in its application by showing how a law about parades was used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens their First Amendment privileges. Now, again, I want to draw your attention to the brackets in that response to number 16, where you see privileges. The S is in brackets. That is not part of the original text, but in order for this to make this a sentence, we needed to add that S. You will also see to deny citizens their First Amendment privileges, and so it was originally just the, but in order to make this fit the correct sentence structure, we needed to put the IR for there, and that's why you see the brackets there. Remember, sometimes we have to add things to our text in order to make sure that we are using the correct sentence structure. All right, let's look at the next question. What words could replace the word sublimely in this context? So sublimely in this context means superbly or perfectly. So that's another kind of parallel or some another synonym that you can use in this particular context. And then what imagery helps you understand the meaning of the word excruciating? The chopping block is where limbs were cut off, so excruciating must be an adjective that describes an extreme amount of pain. And then how does King use figurative language in paragraph 17, and how does it further his purpose? King uses figurative language to describe the suffering that early Christians were willing to endure to disobey unjust laws. This furthers his purpose by providing evidence that there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience, okay? So you should have those answers, and you should have refined some of your responses. And then let's look at just 2 more questions and look at those responses to see how we can continue this journey. All right, in paragraph 17, how does King use the examples of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the early Christians, and Socrates to further his purpose? What is the impact of these specific references considering King's addressees? Remember, I said you're going to need to understand those allusions to biblical as well as historical figures. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are religious figures that you should know or have some knowledge of. And Socrates is a philosopher, a famous philosopher, and so he alludes to these and actually uses their names to help him in this address. So let's look at some of the responses there. He uses these examples to create a historical and moral precedent for this kind of civil disobedience. And by using biblical and historical references, King compares himself and his fellow civil rights activists to people likely valued by the addressees. This makes King and his fellow activists seem like heroes. Some of you may note that by their implication, this means that addressees are opposing people who are like their own biblical and historical heroes. Whew, that's a big one, guys. Yeah, some of his addressees may not have picked up on those things, but some of them we are sure they did. Let's look at this last question before we move forward with our rhetorical impact tracking tool. What does King imply in the last sentence of paragraph 17? How does this implication develop his purpose? King implies that without civil disobedience, we would not have positive things today like academic freedom. This develops his purpose by showing how important civil disobedience is for creating positive change. Lots and lots of rhetoric, lots of figurative language, lots of ethos, pathos, logos, and all of the things in this little bitty section, paragraphs 16 through 18. Lots of places for you to track that rhetorical impact. So I'm going to give you a second, and I want you to, you can do this with a partner or you can do this individually, and I want you to track that rhetoric. Great job, guys. All right, one more section before we move on to some more things. So I want you with a partner or, again, a small group, either one, I want you to reread paragraph 18 and answer the questions on your board. Great job. All right, let's look at some of the responses that I heard you guys sharing as we moved through this section. All right, so how does the example of the legality of everything Hitler did in Germany further King's purpose? Ooh, guys, they bring in Hitler on this one. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? All right, so let's see. The example furthers his purpose by showing how evil, unjust laws can be. It also compares segregations in America to Nazi Germany. That's a strong accusation there. And it's even stronger now that we know so much more about Hitler and Nazi Germany. But definitely something that caught the attention of the people who were reading this letter at the time it was written. All right, how does King's statement that he would advocate disobeying these anti-religious laws if he lived in a communist country further his purpose? The example highlights the duty that one has to disobey unjust laws, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, okay? All right, the last question we're going to look at is how does King's reference to the suppression of principles dear to the Christian faith in a communist country further his purpose? Again, you are asked to consider his addressees. King focuses on the suppression of principles dear to the Christian faith because he and his audience are Christian leaders. This furthers his purpose by including a scenario where his addressees might also disobey certain laws. Okay? Not quite as much rhetoric in this, but when you consider the allusion, when you consider the references that he uses, there's lots of rhetoric to put in your rhetorical impact tracking tool. So I'm going to give you a minute to track that now before we move on to our quick write. All right, great job. You're going to use the tool that you just completed. And again, you need a piece of paper for your quick write. I want you to determine King's purpose in paragraphs 16 through 18 and analyze how he uses rhetoric to advance that purpose. We answered that question in some of these other responses, maybe not specifically exactly the same way, but we did get there. So I want you to put that in writing in your words, and then we will come back and talk about your homework for the evening. Great job. All right, we are almost done, so let's look at the homework and let's close out today's lesson. I want you to read paragraphs 19 through 21, and I want you to box unfamiliar words and look up their definitions. Choose the definition that makes the most sense in the context and write a brief definition above or near the word. Also, review your argument delineation tool to identify the central claims that King makes in paragraphs 1 through 18. So you're doing lots of things here. You're rereading paragraphs 1 through 18 to find those central claims, and you are reading paragraphs 19 through 21. Okay, so lots to do tonight, but that's okay. You've got this. All right, until next time, happy learning.